Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going on a seriously fascinating journey into a really groundbreaking philosophical model from a May 2026 paper. We're talking about the revised two-domain ADI ontology. Now, if you've ever laid awake at night, staring at the ceiling and pondering the ultimate architecture of existence, you are absolutely in the right place. Because today, step by step, we're going to map out the very limits of reality itself. So, where is the absolute boundary of reality? Honestly, it's the ultimate existential hook, isn't it? I mean, is the edge of reality simply where physical structure ends? Where atoms and stars and space-time just sort of fade into nothing? Or does the true boundary lie somewhere much, much deeper, way past the most abstract, formulous concepts our minds can even conceive? Well, to figure that out, we're going to need a really rigorous framework. Okay, here's our roadmap for today's conceptual climb. First, we'll look at the metaphysical classification problem. Second, domain D, which is created reality. Third, the internal layers of creation. Fourth, domain G, the uncreated divine. And finally, the ultimate boundary statement. Let's get right into it. All right, section 1, the metaphysical classification problem, rethinking the deepest distinction. Okay, let's dive into this. Older metaphysical systems had this really fundamental flaw. It was basically a false dichotomy. They tried to divide reality by structured versus unstructured. So if they stumbled upon something that didn't have a physical form, they just assumed, well, it must need its own ultimate separate domain. And as you can guess, that led to this incredibly messy, endless list of categories. But the ADI framework reveals the true distinction: created contingency versus uncreated divine necessity. The absolute deepest dividing line isn't about what a thing looks like or if it has form. It's simply whether it was created or if it is the uncreated source. Moving on to section 2, domain D, the container of everything. So let's define the first ultimate half of this framework. Here is our formal definition. Domain D is the total created domain. It encompasses all physical, conceptual, unseen, and even entirely formless creations, going right up to the highest possible created boundary. Honestly, it helps to think of it kind of like a massive video game. Whether you're looking at a fully rendered 3D castle, the invisible lines of background code, or even the super abstract game logic itself, it doesn't matter. It is all ultimately trapped inside the game engine. Createdness is literally the only ticket to entry into Domain D. Which brings us to section 3, the internal layers of creation, the boundary ascent. All right, we are now going to begin our ascent through the internal hierarchy of Domain D, just to see how wildly layered this container actually is. We start at the bottom with step 1, created structure, or DSE. Then we push upward to step 2, created formlessness, DF. Ascending even higher, we hit step 3, meta-created formlessness, DMF. And finally, we reach the absolute ceiling at step 4, the created boundary, DB. Now, every single step pushes us further and further away from human comprehension, right? But, and this is key, every single step remains entirely trapped inside the created container. Let's break those first two steps down really quickly. DS is essentially our everyday world. Space-time, math, logic, physics, the whole shebang. But step up to DF, created formlessness, and things start to get pretty wild. This is reality that is completely unbound by ordinary form or sequence. It totally challenges our imagination and elevates us way above normal physics. But because its existence is still derived from something else, we are still firmly inside the created universe. Now we're hitting the absolute maximum limits of abstraction. D under MF is meta-created formlessness. This is higher order formlessness, meaning it's stuff that's formless even relative to the formless layer we just talked about. And finally, D under B, the created boundary. This is the maximal horizon, the absolute highest limit of creation before the total break. So why are we spending so much time defining this? Well, because these layers protect our human minds from a really dangerous philosophical trap. The assumption that just because something is completely formless and totally incomprehensible, it must therefore be God. The ADI framework steps in and says, no way. Incomprehensibility is just the upper floor of Domain D. Take a look at this. In this framework, D is much, much less than G. But listen, this isn't just some standard quantitative mathematical less than symbol. It represents a complete, total, absolute ontological discontinuity. Getting to the very absolute edge of the created boundary, D sub B, does not mean you can just take one more step and magically cross over into G. Not at all. G is categorically entirely other.
And that takes us to Section 4, Domain G, the absolute break.
So let's shift our focus to the other side of that absolute break. Domain G is defined incredibly narrowly and absolutely as the uncreated divine domain. It contains a law, divine knowledge, divine will, divine power, and everything that belongs properly to uncreated divine reality. I really need to point out a crucial distinction right here. Domain G is not simply the most formless region of existence, okay? It's not just the highest layer of abstraction on some continuum. Instead, it is the completely uncaused source that does not depend on absolutely anything outside of itself. It is necessary, it is self-sufficient, and it is entirely uncreated.
Finally, Section 5, the ultimate boundary statement. Let's formalize the metaphysics.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the ADI framework doesn't leave these boundaries vague at all. It locks them in with some incredibly strict philosophical axioms. Exhaustive inclusion and divine exclusivity guarantee that literally everything is sorted purely by created versus uncreated. Domain disjointness ensures D and G never, ever overlap. But it's really those last two that are the heavy hitters. Ontological non-conversion and boundary non-divinization mathematically prove that no amount of upward ascent in domain D ever converts reality into domain G. To put it simply, you cannot iterate or climb your way out of D into G. The gap is absolute. And that leads right into a really profound philosophical realization from the source text. Within the ADI system, the phrase Allahu Akbar, which translates to God is greater, is actually not analyzed just as a standard devotional phrase. It functions as the ultimate epistemic and ontological boundary statement. It declares formally that God remains greater than literally whatever domain D can formulate, represent, transcend, or even meta-transcend. Basically, whatever the created mind can possibly posit, it always remains trapped inside D. Which brings us nicely to the final formulation straight from the text. The ADI framework contains two ultimate domains only. The ultimate distinction is not structure versus formlessness, but created contingency versus uncreated divine necessity. I just love how beautifully this distills such a massive, complex taxonomy into a simple, rigorous, and incredibly powerful ontology. It totally protects the purity of the uncreated domain while still allowing the created universe to be exactly as infinitely complex as it needs to be. I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative thought to dwell on today. If even the absolute most formless, transfinite, totally incomprehensible boundaries of reality are ultimately just inside a dependent created container, what does that actually reveal about the infinite gap between our own human cognition and the strictly uncreated? It's a staggering thought for sure. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the ADI framework. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.